The wind, a mournful caller, clawed at the corners of Elias Thorne's cabin, its voice a constant reminder of the encroaching winter and the solitude he had carved from the raw, unforgiving land. Dust, fine as ground bone, sifted through invisible cracks in the chinking, coating the rough-hewn table where a chipped enamel mug sat, its contents long cold. Elias watched the grey light of a dying afternoon through the single, begrimed window. His beard, streaked with an untimely silver, caught the fading light, much like the frost clinging to the sparse, skeletal trees outside. Each day bled into the next, a slow, deliberate march away from a past he carried like a shroud. The silence of the high plains was usually broken only by the cry of a hawk or the distant, mournful lowing of his few cattle. It was a silence he had cultivated, a balm and a penance. He moved with the slow economy of a man who conserves every motion, every breath. His hands, gnarled and stained by work and weather, rested on the worn wood of the sill, still capable, still strong, though the purpose behind their strength had long since withered. He remembered other hands, smaller, softer, and the memory was a fresh stab, even after all these years. The fire in the stone hearth had burned low, mirroring the embers of his own spirit. He should add wood, but the chill that settled deeper than the bone was one no flame could truly touch. The land outside was vast, indifferent, a canvas of browns and greys that stretched to a bruised horizon. It suited him. It asked nothing, offered nothing but hardship, and in that there was a stark kind of honesty. Then, a sound, sharp and alien in the symphony of wind and desolation, a knock. Not the tentative scratch of a branch, but a human fist against his door. Elias straightened, his body tensing, the familiar weight of suspicion settling upon him. Visitors were rare to the point of being apparitions, and seldom brought good tidings. He moved from the window, his worn boots making little sound on the packed earth floor. He didn't reach for the rifle propped near the door, not yet, but its presence was a silent comfort. He paused, listening. Another knock, more urgent this time, accompanied by a faint, almost lost whimper that the wind tried to snatch away. He pulled the heavy door inward a crack, the cold air rushing in like an invading force, carrying with it the scent of snow and desperation. Framed in the opening was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, etched with a terror that seemed to have hollowed her out from the inside. Her shawl was thin, offering little protection against the biting wind that whipped her dark hair across her face. Clutched to her sides, almost hidden in the folds of her skirt, were two small children, bundled tight, their faces pinched and blue with cold, wide eyes staring up at him with a mixture of fear and blank exhaustion. The woman's lips trembled, whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. She met his gaze, her own dark and deep, holding a universe of flight and sorrow. Her voice, when it came, was raspy, raw. "They ain't yours," she said, the word stark against the moan of the wind, her eyes fixed on his, pleading, defiant. "But they need you." Elias Thorne said nothing. His face, weathered and unreadable as the grey rock of the mountains that loomed to the west, registered no immediate response. The wind howled a counterpoint to her stark declaration, tugging at the woman's thin shawl, making the children press closer to her legs, their small bodies trembling visibly. He saw the desperation clinging to her like the frost on the prairie grass, the kind that stripped away all pretense, leaving only raw, urgent need. The boy, perhaps 3 winters old, coughed, a dry, rattling sound that seemed too large for his small frame. The girl, his twin by the look of her, buried her face deeper into her mother's skirt, a tiny, muffled sob escaping. "Mail order," the woman managed, her voice cracking. "That's what I told myself it'd be." A way out, her gaze flickered past him, into the dim interior of the cabin, then back to his impassive face. "It ain't that. Not anymore." Not for a long time. Elias's eyes, the color of a winter sky, narrowed slightly. He knew the arrangements. Men out here, starved for company, for a woman's hand, would send for them. But her words, "they ain't yours," hung heavy, a truth that negated that particular transaction from the start. He was a solitary man, not a hopeful homesteader looking to populate his claim. His life was a closed book, its final chapters already written in grief. He had nothing to offer. Yet, her plea, "but they need you," resonated with a strange, unwelcome chord in the frozen landscape of his soul. Need was a language he understood, even if he had long forgotten how to answer its call. He looked at the children, their faces small and pale, their eyes vast pools of fear reflecting the vastness of the empty land surrounding them. They were innocents caught in a current not of their making. His gaze lifted back to the woman. Her name, her story, thus who or what she was fleeing from, none of it mattered in that moment as much as the brutal truth of their condition. The cold was a patient killer. He stepped back, a silent, grudging invitation, pulling the door wider. The meager warmth from the cabin's interior, smelling of wood smoke and old sorrows, spilled out, a fragile offering against the plane's bitter breath. The woman hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if disbelieving, then practically stumbled inside, ushering the children before her. She moved with an exhaustion so profound it seemed a miracle she was still standing. The boy stumbled on the threshold, and Elias, without thought, put out a hand, steadying the small shoulder. The touch was fleeting, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt through him, a forgotten sensation of contact with something small and vulnerable. He withdrew his hand as if burned. Inside, the cabin was sparse, functional. A rough table, 2 stools, a narrow cot in one corner, the stone hearth. It was the home of a man who expected nothing from life and offered little in return. The woman huddled the children near the dying fire, her back to Elias as he closed the door, the latch falling into place with a definitive thud that shut out the wind and, for now, the world. She unwrapped their heads, chafing their small, red hands between her own. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, not looking at him. Elias moved to the hearth, added a few split logs to the embers. The wood caught slowly, then flared, casting dancing shadows on the rough log walls, on the woman's bowed head, on the children's wary faces. He didn't ask her name, nor offer his. Words were an extravagance he couldn't afford, and she, it seemed, had few left to spend. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with the weight of her desperate arrival. He felt like a man standing on the edge of a precipice, the ground crumbling beneath his feet. He had built his walls high and strong, but these small, shivering interlopers had breached them without a fight, armed only with their vulnerability. The first night was a tapestry of uneasy silences and small, intrusive sounds. The children, exhausted beyond tears, fell into a fitful sleep on a bed of old blankets Elias had wordlessly retrieved from a chest, their mother, Lena, as he eventually learned her name from a mumbled word to the boy, sitting ramrod straight beside them, a sentinel fueled by fear and coffee he'd silently brewed and offered. She sipped it from the chipped mug, her hands wrapped around its warmth as if it were a lifeline. Elias occupied his cot, feigning sleep, but his senses were unnervingly alert. The soft sighs of the sleeping children, the occasional rustle as Lena shifted, the faint, almost sweet scent of their unfamiliar presence, it all wove into the familiar sounds of his isolated world, changing its texture. He was acutely aware of them, of their fragility, of the unspoken danger that had driven them to his door. In the grey light of dawn, he rose, moving with his usual quiet. Lena was already awake, or perhaps had never slept, her eyes shadowed, but her expression was one of fierce resolve as she watched the twins. Samuel, the boy, coughed again in his sleep, a sound that made her visibly flinch. Ilara, the girl, whimpered softly, snuggling closer to her brother. Lena made a move to soothe them, her touch gentle, practiced. Elias stoked the fire, prepared a simple breakfast of oatmeal and dried berries. He placed 3 bowls on the table, not 2. She watched him, her gaze wary but threaded with a dawning, fragile hope. He didn't meet her eyes. He ate standing, by the window, looking out at the snow that had begun to fall during the night, a soft white blanket that smoothed the harsh edges of the land, but also threatened to trap them. Lena coaxed the children to eat. They were shy, their movements small and hesitant, their eyes darting towards Elias as if he were a wolf that might suddenly snarl. He understood. He was a stranger, large and silent, his face a mask. He remembered another child, a girl with hair the color of corn silk, who had once looked at him with unreserved love. The memory was a dull ache, a phantom limb. He pushed it down, back into the vault where he kept such things. He found himself observing Lena. She was young, perhaps younger than his wife had been when she. He cut the thought short. Lena moved with a quiet efficiency, tending to the children, tidying the small space they occupied as if to minimize their intrusion. She found a rag and wiped down the table after they ate, her action speaking of a life where making oneself useful was a means of survival. He saw the way she watched the door, the window, how every gust of wind made her start. The fear was a living thing in her, coiled tight. He chopped more wood than usual that day, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar solace, but even in that solitary task, he felt their presence, an invisible tether. The cabin, his fortress of solitude, felt different. It was still his, but it was no longer solely his. It held new heartbeats, new breaths, new fears. And in the periphery of his consciousness, a terrifying, unwelcome thought began to take root, that their fears might soon become his own. The silence between them was no longer empty, it was filled with the weight of her past and the uncertainty of their shared, unwelcome present. He felt the ice around his heart, so carefully constructed over years of loss, begin to show the faintest of cracks. Days bled into a tentative routine, marked by the rising and setting of a pale, winter sun. Elias provided, his actions speaking where words failed. He hunted, returning with rabbits or a lean deer, which Lena would prepare with a quiet competence, stretching the meager resources. The aroma of stew, however simple, filled the cabin, a scent of domesticity that was both alien and achingly familiar to Elias. He taught her how to bank the fire to last through the night, how to read the signs of the weather in the cloud formations. She learned quickly, her gratitude shown not in effusive thanks, but in the slight easing of the tension in her shoulders, in the way she began to meet his gaze, if only fleetingly. The children, Sam and Ellie, remained wary of him, small shadows flitting at the edge of his vision. But children are resilient. One afternoon, while Elias was mending a piece of tack near the hearth, his calloused fingers surprisingly deft, Sam, emboldened by curiosity or perhaps just boredom, toddled closer. The boy was clutching a roughly carved piece of wood, something Lena must have fashioned for him, shaped vaguely like a horse. He tripped, as small children often do, and the wooden horse skittered across the floor, landing near Elias's boot. Sam froze, his lower lip trembling, expecting a reprimand, perhaps something worse. Elias looked down at the toy, then at the child. For a long moment, he did nothing. Then, slowly, he bent, picked up the crude horse, and held it out. Sam stared at the offering, then at Elias's unreadable face, before snatching the toy and scurrying back to his mother. No words were exchanged, but something shifted in the small cabin. A single thread, fragile as spider silk, had been spun between them. Later that week, as a blizzard raged outside, trapping them in the cabin's dim confines, Lena spoke, her voice low, almost a whisper against the howl of the wind. He won't stop looking. She wasn't looking at Elias, but at the flames in the hearth, her hands clenched in her lap. He thinks we belong to him. The possessiveness in her tone, even when recounting it, sent a chill down Elias's spine that had nothing to do with the storm. The children too, he asked, his voice raspy from disuse. It was one of the few direct questions he had posed. She nodded, a jerky, fearful movement. Especially them. He sees them as an extension. Property, she shuddered. I took his name, for a time. Thought it would be safer. It wasn't. It was a cage. She didn't offer the man's name, and Elias didn't ask. The details were less important than the stark reality of her fear. He understood cages, the invisible bars of grief and regret that had penned him in for years. He saw in her a different kind of imprisonment, one she was fighting to escape. He found himself watching the children more closely. Ellie, with her solemn gaze, and Sam, with his cautious curiosity. He saw not property, but small, vulnerable lives. One evening, sifting through an old wooden chest where he kept remnants of his former life, things he couldn't bring himself to discard, yet couldn't bear to look at, his fingers brushed against a small, smooth object. He pulled it out. A bird, carved from pale wood, its wings slightly upturned as if in mid-flight. His wife, Sarah, had carved it for their daughter, Lily. He hadn't touched it in years. He held it in his palm, the wood warmed by his skin, a conduit to a pain so deep it was almost a part of him. He didn't put it back immediately. He set it on the rough mantelpiece, where the firelight caught its simple lines. It was a silent acknowledgement, a ghost invited to share their meager warmth. Lena noticed it, he knew, though she said nothing. But her eyes, when they met his, held a flicker of understanding, a shared sorrow that needed no words. The blizzard passed, leaving the world outside scoured clean, draped in a blinding white. But the pristine snow could not mask the unease that had settled deep within Elias. Lena's words, "He won't stop looking," echoed in the quiet moments. He began to check the horizon more frequently, his gaze sweeping the empty expanse not just for game, but for any sign of riders, any disturbance in the silent landscape. One morning, checking his trap lines further south than usual, near the broken bluffs where the wind howled like a starving wolf, he found it. Not a clear sign, nothing definitive, but enough. The ashes of a small, hastily extinguished fire, too recent. The distinct print of a shod horse, not his own, heading north, towards his valley. It was subtle, easily missed by an untrained eye, but to Elias, it was a whisper of intent, a cold promise. He circled back to the cabin by a different route, his movements more cautious, his senses heightened to an almost painful degree. The land, once a solace in its indifference, now felt charged with potential threat. He said nothing to Lena when he returned, but she saw it in his eyes, in the grim set of his jaw. Her own anxiety, a constant companion, sharpened. She started at every unfamiliar sound, her hands often going to the children, a protective, instinctive gesture. The fragile peace they had managed to build felt suddenly tenuous, like a thin sheet of ice over deep, cold water. The children, sensitive to the unspoken currents of fear, grew quieter, their small games subdued. Sam no longer ventured far from his mother's side. Ellie watched Elias with wide, questioning eyes. He knew he should send them away, point them towards the distant, vague promise of a town, a stagecoach stop. It would be the sensible thing to do, the way to preserve his hard-won isolation. But the image of them out there alone, Lena and her two small burdens against the vastness, against the unnamed man who considered them his property, gave him pause. The thought of that crude wooden bird on his mantle, a symbol of all he had lost, of his failure to protect, solidified into a new, unwelcome resolve. A week later, the threat ceased to be a ghost in the snow. Elias was splitting wood, the rhythmic crack of the axe a familiar counterpoint to the winter silence, when he saw him. A lone rider, silhouetted against the pale morning sun, sitting his horse on the low ridge overlooking the cabin. He was too far to make out features, but the posture was one of patient observation, like a vulture circling. Elias slowly lowered his axe. His heart, a cold, heavy stone in his chest, began to beat a little faster. He felt Lena's presence behind him, sensed her sudden, sharp intake of breath even before he turned. She had come to the doorway, a basket of mending in her hands, now forgotten at her feet. Her face was ashen, her eyes fixed on the distant figure with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. "It's him," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. "Jedediah." Jedediah Cole. The name meant nothing to Elias, but the way she said it, the dread it invoked, told him everything. Cole. The man who thought they belonged to him. The rider on the ridge didn't move for a long time, just watched. A silent declaration of intent. Then, he slowly turned his horse and disappeared back over the rise. He hadn't approached, hadn't called out. It was a warning. A claim being staked. Elias met Lena's terrified gaze. Her entire body was trembling. The children, sensing their mother's fear, had come to cling to her skirts, their small faces pale. In that moment, the choice was stark. He could tell her to run, to take her chances in the wilderness. Or he could stand. His life had been a long, slow retreat from connection, from responsibility. He had sought emptiness, and found it. But looking at Lena, at the raw fear in her eyes, at the two small lives clinging to her, something shifted within him, something he thought long dead. It wasn't heroism. It was something rawer, more elemental. A refusal. A line drawn in the snow. He picked up the axe, its weight familiar in his hand. "Go inside," he said, his voice level, calm. "Stay with the children." Keep them quiet. She looked at him, her eyes searching his, finding not reassurance, perhaps, but a grim resolve that mirrored her own desperation. She nodded, a single, jerky movement, then herded the twins back into the dim cabin, closing the door behind them. Elias Thorne stood alone in the cold sunlight, the axe in his hand, and watched the empty ridge. The time for running was over. The cabin, once a refuge of solitude, transformed into a makeshift fortress. Elias worked with a grim, focused intensity he hadn't felt in years. He barred the heavy plank door from the inside with an iron rod he usually kept for the forge. The single window, already small, he reinforced with extra shutters, leaving only narrow slits for observation and, if necessary, defense. He checked his rifle, an old but reliable Winchester, cleaning and oiling it with practiced hands. Ammunition was not plentiful, but he had enough. Each bullet was a stark calculation. He moved the cot and the table to offer better cover, turning the familiar space into something alien and tactical. Lena watched him, her fear a palpable presence in the small room, but beneath it, a desperate courage began to surface. She didn't weep or plead. Instead, she asked, her voice tight, "What can I do?" He looked at her, saw the steel in her eyes. "Keep the children calm. Keep them down. If shooting starts, they stay on the floor." Under the cot he handed her his hunting knife, its blade sharp and well-maintained. "If they get in, you know what to do." Her hand closed around the hilt, her knuckles white. She nodded, understanding the grim implication. There would be no surrender. The twins, Sam and Ellie, were bewildered by the sudden shift, by the hushed, urgent atmosphere. Lena gathered them onto the blankets under the cot, speaking to them in low, soothing tones, though her eyes constantly darted to the door, to Elias. He saw in her not just a mother protecting her young, but a woman who had reached her breaking point, who would fight with the ferocity of a cornered animal. The weight of his own past pressed down on him. Sarah. Lily. He had been miles away, trapping, when the fever took them, swift and merciless. He had returned to a silent cabin, to a grief that had hollowed him out. He had failed to protect them from the indiscriminate cruelty of fate. This time, the threat had a face, a name. Jedediah Cole. And this time, Elias Thorne would not be absent. It wasn't redemption he sought, that was a concept too grand for the bitter landscape of his heart. It was simpler. It was a stand. A final, perhaps futile, defiance against the forces that sought to crush the vulnerable. As dusk began to bleed across the snow-covered plains, casting long, eerie shadows, an unnatural quiet descended. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath. Elias stood by the narrow slit in the window shutter, the rifle cool in his hands, waiting. They came as the last vestiges of twilight surrendered to a cold, star-dusted night. 3 riders, dark shapes moving against the snow, their approach unnervingly silent until they were close enough for the crunch of hooves on frozen ground to be heard. Elias watched them, his breath misting in the frigid air. One figure, larger than the others, dismounted some 50 yards from the cabin. Jedediah Cole. Even in the dim light, his arrogance was palpable. "Thorne." Cole's voice cut through the stillness, rough and confident. "I know you're in there. Send out what's mine. Send out Lena and the brats." No need for this to get uglier. Elias remained silent, his eyes sighting down the barrel of the Winchester. He could hear Lena's sharp, indrawn breath from where she huddled with the children. "She took something that belongs to me, Thorne. Something I paid for, one way or another." Cole's voice rose, edged with anger. "Don't be a fool. They ain't your concern." Elias's finger tightened almost imperceptibly on the trigger. "They're under my roof," he called back, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, carrying clearly in the cold air. "That makes them my concern." A harsh laugh from Cole. "Your roof? This shack? I'll burn it to the ground with you in it if I have to." He gestured to the men with him. "Last chance, old man." The response was the sharp crack of Elias's rifle. The bullet slammed into the snow just short of Cole's feet, sending up a spray of white. Cole cursed, jumping back. "Stubborn bastard," he roared. The other two riders fanned out, dismounting, taking cover behind the meager shelter of a few frozen cottonwoods that lined the dry creek bed near the cabin. The siege had begun. Muzzle flashes bloomed in the darkness, bullets thudding into the thick log walls of the cabin. Splinters flew. Elias returned fire, methodically, aiming carefully, conserving his shots. He was a patient man. He knew this land, knew the angles. Lena, huddled with the children, began to softly sing a lullaby, her voice trembling but steady, a fragile shield of sound against the violence. Sam and Ellie were silent, their small bodies pressed against her. The air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. The night wore on, a relentless exchange of sporadic gunfire. Cole's men were cautious, probing, testing the cabin's defenses. Elias met their efforts with stoic resolve, his shots precise, aimed to deter, to wound if necessary, but mostly to keep them at bay. He knew they couldn't maintain this indefinitely. His ammunition was limited. Cole, driven by a possessive rage, would not give up easily. Inside the cabin, the tension was a living entity. Lena, despite her fear, proved to be a steady presence. She reloaded the spare pistol Elias had, her hands surprisingly calm, and passed him water from their dwindling supply. She did not speak, but her eyes, when they met his in the flickering light of a single, shielded lantern, conveyed a grim solidarity. A bullet punched through the wooden shutter near Elias's head, showering him with splinters. He didn't flinch, merely shifted his position. He could feel a dull ache in his left shoulder where an earlier ricochet had grazed him, a burning reminder of his vulnerability. The attackers made a concerted rush just before dawn, when the darkness was at its deepest and spirits at their lowest. Two figures, shadows detaching themselves from the deeper gloom, charged towards the door, hoping to break it down with a heavy log they carried between them. Elias fired twice. One man screamed and fell, clutching his leg. The other hesitated, then dropped the log and scrambled back to cover, dragging his wounded companion. Cole's enraged voice echoed through the pre-dawn chill. "You'll pay for that, Thorn. You'll pay." But there was a new note of frustration in his tone. The cabin, small and insignificant, had proven a tougher nut to crack than he anticipated. Elias knew this was a temporary reprieve. As the first pale light of dawn began to stain the eastern sky, he saw Cole, a dark silhouette against the growing light, staring at the cabin. There was a terrible stillness to him, the stillness of a predator gathering itself for the final strike. Elias checked his remaining bullets. Few. He looked at Lena, at the exhausted, dirt-streaked faces of the children. He had bought them a night. He didn't know if he could buy them a morning. The final confrontation came with the full, cold light of day. Cole, his patience exhausted, his pride wounded, decided on a direct assault. He and his remaining man charged, firing as they came, no longer seeking cover, but fueled by a desperate, reckless fury. Bullets ripped through the cabin walls, a deadly hail. One struck the lantern, plunging them into deeper shadow, the smell of spilled oil adding to the acrid scent of gunpowder. Elias fired, his shots measured, but he was outnumbered, outgunned. He hit the second man in the shoulder, sending him spinning to the ground, but Cole kept coming, a wild look in his eyes, his face contorted with rage. He reached the door, kicking at it with brutal force. The wood splintered, the iron bar groaning under the assault. Elias knew he couldn't hold him off with gunfire alone from this range. He dropped the rifle, grabbing the heavy axe he'd left propped near the door. The bar snapped. The door burst inward. Cole stood framed in the opening, a pistol in his hand, his eyes blazing. "They're mine," he bellowed, lunging into the cabin. In that instant, Lena moved. With a cry that was more animal than human, she threw herself at Cole, the hunting knife Elias had given her flashing in her hand. It was an act of pure, desperate courage, meant to buy seconds. Cole, surprised, backhanded her viciously, sending her sprawling. He raised his pistol towards the cowering children. But those seconds were all Elias needed. He moved with a speed that belied his age, the axe whistling through the air. It connected with Cole's gun arm with a sickening thud. The pistol clattered to the floor. Cole roared in pain and fury, turning on Elias, his good hand reaching for a knife at his belt. They grappled, two men locked in a primitive struggle, the cramped cabin their arena. It was brutal, raw. Elias felt a searing pain as Cole's knife slashed his side, but he barely registered it. His focus was absolute. He brought the butt of the axe handle up, hard, under Cole's chin. The man's head snapped back. Elias drove him backwards, relentlessly, until Cole stumbled, his eyes wide with a dawning realization of defeat. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Elias swung the axe again. This time, it found its mark. Cole crumpled to the floor, silent. A profound, ringing silence descended, broken only by Elias's harsh, ragged breathing and Lena's choked sobs as she crawled towards her children. The fight was over. The aftermath was a landscape of quiet devastation. Outside, the snow was stained crimson in places. The wounded man Cole had brought had dragged himself away, leaving a bloody trail that disappeared into the trees. Cole lay still within the cabin. Elias, leaning heavily against the wall, his side a burning agony, watched Lena gather Sam and Ellie into her arms. They were crying now, the terror finally finding release, but they were alive. Unharmed. He pushed himself upright, ignoring the wave of dizziness that threatened to overwhelm him. There were things to be done. He dragged Cole's body out of the cabin, away from the children's sight, leaving it in the cold indifference of the snow. He would deal with it later. Lena, her face bruised, her eyes still wide with shock but also with a dawning, fierce relief, came to him. She tore a strip from her petticoat and, her hands trembling, began to clean and bind the deep gash in his side. Words were unnecessary, their shared ordeal a bond forged in violence and fear. Her touch was gentle, surprisingly steady. He endured it in silence, the pain a dull counterpoint to the exhaustion settling deep in his bones. Later, after the immediate wounds were tended, she rebuilt the fire, its warmth a small comfort against the chill that lingered in the air, a chill that was more than just the winter cold. She found what little food remained and prepared a meal, a thin broth, some hard biscuits. They ate in silence, the children huddled between them at the rough table, their small hands occasionally reaching out to touch Lena, or even, tentatively, Elias. The cabin, scarred and battered, felt different again. No longer just a fortress, nor just his solitary shell. It was a place of survival, of a grim victory. As the sun climbed higher, casting a weak, watery light through the damaged shutters, Elias looked at Lena, at the twins. A new, unspoken understanding rested between them. He had protected them. They had, in turn, pulled him back from the edge of his own desolate world. He was still a haunted man, his past a permanent shadow, but now, there were new, fragile lives intertwined with his. It wasn't the life he had envisioned, nor one he had sought. But as he watched Sam tentatively offer him a piece of his biscuit, a gesture of innocent trust, Elias felt a stirring in the frozen depths of his heart, something akin to a fragile, heavy hope. The war was over, the quiet, uncertain peace had just begun.